also referred to as abnormal psychology. And we have a course at Butte on abnormal psychology. This is a standard course in the major. And today we'll work to shed a little bit of light on some of the ways that we think about psychological disorders. And you've seen this slide before. This is the one that talks about how most people saw disorders differently back in the pre-1800s, before the rise of the medical model. This is an image of bloodletting, which was a common practice back then. You've probably seen it in movies, where they release blood from different parts of the body, just drain it, thought to help release the spirit or the ailment, including the head, for mental disorders, as you can see here. And sometimes it would work, just because removing some of the blood, might help on occasion, but most often, obviously not. And in the 1900s, you're also aware that we had the rise of what's referred to as the medical model, with the scientific method beginning to overtake thinking about things from sort of a more metaphysical, spiritual causality to a more scientific causality. And of course, Freud was one of the persons on the cusp of that, with his case of Dora, along with a bunch of other leaders like Darwin. And when we're going to do therapy next, remember Freud used to use talk therapy to help treat Dora of conversion disorder. And you remember conversion disorder is a somatic disorder of the body, a neurological disorder where things don't function quite right. Usually entails tremors and like difficulty with balance and things like that. So the medical model focuses on looking at the physical causes, medical causes, instead of, say, supernatural causes. And we have a couple of dimensions that the medical model looks at, four of them in particular. The first one is etiology, and this is a good word to memorize now. It is on the quiz. Etiology means cause. It means cause. So when we say what's a disorder's etiology, that's a nice fancy word for cause. And then, of course, we have the diagnosis, figuring out what the symptoms are and being able to distinguish one disorder from another. And it's basically based on symptoms, which are a description of what a person experiences and how they behave, right? And then a treatment plan, figuring out a way. Here it says in a psychiatric hospital. Well, this is in the early days. And of course, most of it wasn't in psychiatric hospitals. And then prognosis means forecasts, or what is the future potential of the person's health relative to this disorder. And today we have really good prognosis for most of the disorders, not all of them. Some of them are, and some of it depends on severity. But we have some very good treatments now over the last even just 30, 40 years. Some exceptional treatments have developed. Just a tiny bit of early history. First insane asylum, formerly set up in Bethlehem, London, about 1400 AD, also referred to as Bedlam. So Bedlam, London. So you have a little sub-community at Bethlehem. So here you have the idea of bedlam or craziness. Even though most mentally ill were not confined to mental hospitals, conditions in the hospitals were pretty deplorable until we move into the medical. They use punitive, trying to beat out evil spirits and things like that, cast them away. Here we have a few of the early medical model theorists going through the turn from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, as we have a shift in thinking. And now you all think scientifically about this, right? So you can see from this that it was a fairly quick transition, where in almost all of human history there's spiritual dimensions as causality, which can play a role, because this is a dimension of our life, right? And we don't have to excise that because it's not the totality of it. It didn't have the scientific mindset that you have. And it's just interesting to notice that in less than 100 years, the scientific mindset has been the norm, at least in our culture and Western cultures, and some of the more educated cultures that have basically are comfortable enough to be able to send their children to school instead of farming and surviving, right? Lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy. So here's a new one for you. Early 1800s, Benjamin Rush considered by many the father of American psychiatry, proposed humane methods for caring for children with emotional or behavioral disorders. And look at this really quite progressive quote, right? Unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize an undercover dictatorship. And I think he would look at, the way medical care in our country is with insurance companies and so on. Um, exactly meets that criteria. To restrict the art of healing to one class of men and deny equal privilege to others will be to constitute the Bastille of medical science. All such laws are un-American and despotic, have no place in a republic. The Constitution of this republic should make special privilege for medical freedom as well as religious freedom. So powerful statement, and obviously not something we paid attention to. And just notice that we're one of the only industrialized countries that's wealthy that does not have medical care, just so you know, and we may be the only one at this point. Okay, back to the subject. 1909, Freud comes to America. I love this picture. I thought you might get a kick out of it at this point. Here's Freud. Look how he looks, what? He's about 50, right? 45, 50, 50. And here's Jung, 15 years younger. That's a young, and younger than Freud. And then this is G. Stanley Hall, who was an American at Clark University and founding president of the American Psychological Association and a very well-known and acknowledged psychiatrist in his own right. And here below, you can't see it, but in the PowerPoint, there's a link to an article on Freud's visit to Clark University, which is cool. All right, so the definition of a psychological disorder after we move into the medical model, early 1900s, starting to think about, much of psychology starts focusing on identifying and labeling the psychological disorders. And a disorder is defined pretty simply. First, deviates from cultural norms. Second, it's maladaptive. It interferes with the person's ability to have relationships and function well in the world. And, just thinking about how well we're functioning in the world and how well we're able to interface with our relationships, manage emotions, keep motivated, stay moving towards our goals, those kinds of things, being able to work with the people around us and so on. These are baseline things we need to be able to succeed, right? And whenever we deal with internal strife, which is, emotional strife, causes distress or suffering, internal strife, it's difficult for these things to happen, right? Now, up here you can see that this first one is controversial. And that's because in the 1970s, as we start to get aware of global awareness, and philosophically, this is referred to, created a perspective called postmodernism, which is essentially recognizing that all different perspectives have value, right? As compared to the early way of thinking where we would consider ourselves superior and more evolved, say, than native tribes, right? Now we have the mindset, well, we may be more educated, but that doesn't make us better innately, right? And so there's a difference in the thinking there, and that difference, and that's sort of a postmodern thought. Now, there's some, the criticism of postmodern thought today is that is that it can lead to suggest that means everything's of equal value, meaning every cultural tradition is just as good as anybody else's cultural tradition, and you shouldn't intervene in any cultural traditions. And anthropologists point to things like widow burning widows as a tradition because their husbands have died, and should we or should we not intervene in certain ones? Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the female well, it's not female, the female genital mutilation that goes on in Africa. So it's difficult. It's difficult to reflect and solve these problems of how much, can we consider ourselves more developed enough to be intervening in somebody else's affairs, even if they're not a threat to us, right? So that, by the way, those are the two sides of postmodernism. The recognition of that there's lots of different ways of being different, and certainly there's many groups that have cultural norms that we would consider strange, and so where do you draw the line on that, right? And in the early days of Freud's time, the line was drawn pretty quick. People who were different were very different and quickly looked down on, and you can see here a couple of things that we consider absurd, that were considered normal back then, and if people didn't comply with them, it was considered abnormal, right? So female assertion was not considered a normal trait, and neither was a slave wanting to assert and have freedom, a slave human being. So one of the things, because we talked earlier about perception, and perception is like a prism through which we see and interpret the world, mentally, emotionally, and cognitively. And it can be very subtle, but a term for this kind of influences of one's time and cultural and place is called zeitgeist. It's a great term, German term. It summarizes the idea of spirit of the times of a particular era and space, right? So how we think influences things. So certainly the Victorian era and Freud's own background, even with somewhat of an Oedipal relationship with his mother himself, led to Freud's sort of hyper focus on sexuality. Actually, that's not really fair to say, because Freud was also heavily influenced by Darwin. And Darwin is looking at reproduction and survival as being the two primary instincts. And as you can see from the dress of the Victorian era, we're definitely subjugating those animalistic instincts that are part of the biological matrix, as you already know, because you know about the reptilian and mammal brain. And of course, all of our nervous system we share with, with other species, and so nature sort of conserves and duplicates. And so these systems that run behind the scenes within us, immune system, digestive system, temperature regulation system, sense of place system, visual system, and so on, are extremely old. But back to the point here, I mean, they're aeons old. And so we have very old systems in them, and Freud's recognizing this. So, but his exclusivity, I suppose, would be fair. The fact that he honed in so much as compared to some of you did personality theorists on some of the neo-Freudians like Horney and Adler, and they're looking at more social relationships and these kinds of things, right? And he didn't really expand to those dimensions, right? But back to the zeitgeist, you can see how different the Victorian era, and over here we have the Roaring Twenties, and much less social inhibition and clothing inhibition. Earlier, the Vikings, I like to think, I watched the Vikings TV show on History Channel, and it's really quite fascinating. I mean, it's very well done, but it's also quite fascinating to see how the culture was organized, especially when you consider that those people are now like the mellowest up in Sweden and Denmark and so on. Least violent culture. So it's really interesting, and most, sort of gender equal. So it's very interesting to just consider the violent dimension of the Viking culture. And then, of course, the sexual disinhibition of 1990s and Madonna and so on, which we still have today, right? So the zeitgeist is determined by these dynamics, the distribution of power, which runs through all levels of our lives, and then who gets to do what, who gets to decide what, whose decision is the final decision, whether it's related to money and resources in the government or at home, right, or at school or at work. And then the social environment, you can see here, and then movements as well, changes. These movements, and the movement we should put in here is the web, the World Wide Web, and computers, the technological movements that have happened. You can see these, like the scientific era really marshaled in a whole massive change, and now we're in the middle of a movement right now, right? So this is just a quick slide that talks about how the value judgments behind what is considered normal are hard to see. It's like a fish trying to see the water it's swimming in. But nonetheless, we have this very agile mind that can actually step outside itself and look at itself and try to understand itself. So we can do it to some extent, especially by being aware of the cultural matrix and reflecting on it and trying to step outside our own fish water, right? So some of the aspects of the matrix where you can see quite transparently in more modern times how it influences our thinking. One of them is ADHD. We already talked about this, how another interpretation at the very beginning of ADHD is that as a hunter gene, right? The idea that being a movement-oriented person and being a person who notices things on the periphery, who's wired to do that, so that will be the first ones. They'll be the best hunters and gatherers. They're going to be the ones who catch the smoke And the predator, they're going to be the ones, Aragorn and Fellowship of the Ring, total ADHD, right? But you put them in a box and it becomes tough because they're not wired for that particular matrix, right? So that's a perceptual shift. And when you tell people with ADHD this, and it's a neurological awareness that we gained over the last 20 years. When you tell them this, it really helps them. That doesn't mean it helps them any better when you have to sit in a box and focus on one thing, but it helps with the whole sense of self, right? Suddenly, you understand that there's a value to this biological wiring, and nature pretty much puts a value into all of it. Even the mutations are of value. We need them for the survival, diversity, and the evolution of the species. So homosexuality was listed as in the DSM as a mental disorder until 1973, when they couldn't prove through voluminous research that people of alternative sexualities, at least of homosexual sexualities and most of the alternative sexualities, it's the distribution curve. The vast majority of them are no more or less psychologically stable than the rest of the population. So you cannot validate using it as a diagnostic criteria. Something that's scrambled over all the time, by the way, deciding what is and is not a diagnostic disorder. And so obviously homosexuality got booted out. Society's norms can also play a role in eliciting mental disorders, right? So you're going to see that, for example, we have higher rates of anxiety and depression in the United States than in some of the other countries in the world. Why would that be? And obviously, cultures that have access to modern American media, that's a strong correlate to eating disorders. Don't generally see eating disorders in cultures that don't have access to that imagery. All kinds of fascinating research on that. This is the DSM-5. It's the fifth version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So scratch statistical. It's the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders. All right, scratch this part. And so you know what that means. It's the Manual of Mental Disorders. It helps us diagnose. And statistical just means it's based on scientific research. Okay, basically on measurements of symptoms and symptom data. This is the fifth version, and in the 50s, the first version, 2013, the fifth version was published, and it takes about 15 years to wrestle over all the new things, the changes and the information in order to make some decisions, because this is all a collaboration of a lot of high-level professionals, right, and the American Psychiatric Association. Very highly peer-reviewed, so lots of transparency and lots of trying to sort things out, agreeing and disagreeing. Now, just determining and diagnosing disorders, right? People are diagnosed frequently with disorders. So people will come forward and say, I've been diagnosed with depression, or I've been diagnosed with anxiety disorder or social anxiety. And then they'll say, I have depression, or I have social anxiety. And that's where we end up transitioning from experiencing the disorder as a state or condition to identifying with the disorder, and it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy where we begin to live it out, right? So that's a major disadvantage of the disorder, and obviously stigma is another one. But the idea that we get this idea that we are this, and then that's what we are, rather than this is something we're going through or transitioning through. We're experiencing it. Like when we do the same thing kind of when we have a cold, but we know that the cold is temporary, and we tend to think that less frequently about the disorders. Now, it's true that some experiences, especially if you've had, a pretty intense series of childhood traumas followed by an intense series of adult traumas, then it's going to be tough. It's going to be harder to knock off some of these disorders. But many, these experiences of distress that we label disorders, but psychological or mental disorders, but many of them are disordered experiences. They're experience states that we can move into a better, at least certainly a significantly better state. And the diagnostic labels of the disorders help us to figure that out. They help us understand and begin to identify common symptoms. They create understanding among people in the sense that they're not alone, and they help us be able to identify treatment plans. So just be aware that there are definitely cons to labeling, and we need to watch out for this one. Become aware of, not over-identifying with a label and giving ourselves a permanent stamp with it. Now, a little bit of intro to the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, the fifth version. We're just going to take a little peek at it for a few minutes. It's organized on a developmental and lifespan basis, and it uses some of the more current, it incorporates some of the more current neurocognitive research that is going on, both in terms of data as well, just general research data, as well as all of the neuroscience and PET scans that are going on. And the way it's organized is that it tends to begin with disorders that are in earlier life, which tend to be more neurodevelopmental disorders, right? Like disorders that happen during the neurological early developmental stages of a child that show up as behavioral differences like autism, for example, and schizophrenia spectrum or psychotic disorders. And then it moves into adolescence and adulthood. And here we're looking at more the adolescence one, we more often see the rise of affective disorders. That's more emotion-based disorders. And then here again, neurocognitive on another level. Over here, we're looking at Alzheimer's and dementia, right, as a couple of neurocognitive disorders. Here are the DSM-V diagnostic categories. And we got slides for these. Your task for your assignment is to select a disorder. These are broader categories in which there are several disorders. For example, in neurodevelopmental disorders, there are disorders like autism and ADHD spectrum disorders. So there are several disorders within these categories, and so you pick a disorder within these categories. One that's in the book or one you're particularly curious about and you study it. Let's run through these quickly though. First, the neurodevelopmental disorders. These are disorders where something goes on in the neurological development of the child, and we're learning more and more about how epigenetic influences, environmental influences, whether they be viruses or exposures to certain things, especially in the earliest prenatal and in the early developmental stages of a child, can have some significant impacts. And things like autism have there are various epigenetic sources of how autism can happen. And deep research is being done on all these, and you'll find all kinds of information coming out all the time. One of my favorite sources for very current information on these is ScienceDaily.com. You can just jump on it. Here you see how they overlap, and they do frequently overlap. So several of these can be combined, right, where you have motor disorder as well as autism. Or here's the specific learning disorders like dyslexia. Then we have schizophrenia, spectrum, and other psychotic disorders. And here we need to talk about this word psychotic, which means not in touch with reality. That's what psychotic means. And being psychotic, which is not in touch with reality, is a common symptom of schizophrenia. Okay, so psychotic experiences include things like delusions and hallucinations, but what happens is that the delusions and hallucinations they're not just delusions, they're not just hallucinations. Like, for example, if somebody takes a hallucinogen and they experience hallucinations, and then but they don't usually become psychotic. Psychotic is when they get overtaken by the hallucinations and they start to believe the hallucinations. Those are those dramatic stories you hear about where somebody feels like they're being crawled on by spiders or something like that. And delusions, you hear about delusions like delusions of grandeur, right? Or delusions of persecution, right? Being chased, right? So these ideas that somebody is after them, false ideas that are not backed up by reality, and hallucinations that they overtake them over time. And that's what psychosis is when the hallucinations overtake you, when you believe that you are Superman and you go jump off the building, as compared to saying, oh, I feel like Superman. Most of schizophrenics' hallucinations are auditory. They hear voices that interact with them. They also have disorganized speech, and there's actually and disorganized thoughts. So their thoughts are not fluid, they're not coherent, they'll skip around. Even with severe schizophrenics, the words will skip around in a thing they call word salad. So they'll put words that don't make sense together. And then this idea of disorganized, you hear a lot in crime dramas, the idea of disorganized or organized, and that's a very big idea because disorganized means that they aren't thinking clearly. They're in some kind of state of psychosis. And of course, disorganized can be on a continuum where a person becomes increasingly disorganized. For example, when we get totally stressed out, we start to become disorganized. Our thinking becomes less clear, focused, rational, we could say less linear in terms of being, or, and we become more fractured. And if we become increasingly fractured, then we experience this thing of what's called disorganized psychosis. And so then the person's completely kind of not even on the same place that we are. And then negative symptoms. And catatonia, by the way, is not moving, right? So disorganized all the way to point of becoming frozen. So a catatonic schizophrenic is a frozen person. They might rock or something like that, but they don't move, and you've probably heard of that. Negative symptoms means behaviors that are usually present that are not there. So this is a negative symptoms slide. And you can see here with communication, like they almost don't talk, or they have extremely long pauses. And they found out neurologically there's a lot of biological things going on with schizophrenia, and it's a neurocognitive based disease disorder. It's not an emotion based disease disorder, although, of course, it can be triggered by stress because too much cortisol is like a poison, right? Just the right, like too much salt. And so just the right amount is awesome, but you need a little bit just for alertness and energy and sort of that feeling of get up and go, but you throw too much on there and it's toxic, and then that becomes a corrosive variable for a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, making it easier for it to rise. So this break in the sentence structures and things like that, like I said, there's a number of biological things going on with schizophrenia and some variances with some of the different kinds, but again, neurologically based. Brain functioning is the follows behavioral qualities like we've described, and then there's these blocks, and they know that the fluid filled ventricles, these little little streams and rivers that run through our brain of fluid that sort of help cushion it, so if we bang our head, it's this incredibly brilliant compression of thousands and millions really of neurons is saved. Think about your technology, think about your phone, and you put that little bit of rubber around your phone and to protect it in case you drop it. Well, you've got so much more neural circuitry, and your brain is, remember, electrical like your phone, and chemical too, like bleach, and stuff. It's like it's just wild. So it's just a whole different kind of substance than we're used to thinking about in our everyday existence. We don't mess with the material of neurons and how they communicate at all, but it has circuitry just like your phone, and it is sensitive just like your phone, and your brain is surrounded by fluid, and then there's these little canals of fluid that run through the middle of your brain that, I should get a slide of this on there, that help protect the brain in terms of impact, help protect your circuitry. And basically those fluid-filled canals, they grow with people with schizophrenia, and so they end up breaking up neural pathways that have been formed that include cognitive ideas and word structures and things like this. So here's a slide on psychosis, and this is an interesting video to watch. You don't see it on this talk I'm doing, but you could see it when you do the slideshow. And it's Louis Wayne, who, is a very famous artist. He was one of the early graphic illustrators back in the early 1900s during this age. And he developed schizophrenia, and you can see the increasing level of disorganization of the cats all the way to this as his schizophrenia developed. And he still saw patterns, of course, but it doesn't have the same kind of organization. Schizophrenia it's all over the world. So it's not regionally specific. It's within our brain. And there's some fascinating evolutionary theories about where it came from and why. including the idea that early hunter-gatherer man or pre-hunter-gatherer man, say pre-200,000, early, say 500,000 years ago or so, maybe even before, was more disorganized than ours, right? Was more, not like this disorganized, but was not as organized as our mind. And so it had more of this, schizophrenic propensities. Here's some conditions where we also can see some psychosis. We can see some psychosis with bipolar disorder, particularly with mania. Now, it's a different kind of psychosis. It includes a high level of inflation, like a idea that you can do, like I can go to the slot machine and win for sure. That kind of mania. And psychosis of depression is opposite. It's like an extreme negativity bias where the world is falling apart. And these states, they can take us over. And that's where some of the people that we lose through suicide are lost in the state that is some level of psychosis. Now, you can use the distribution curve here with psychosis too. And so you can say that if a person disorganizes emotionally, if they just continue to go down to a state of even moderately severe psychosis and they have depression, then they can become quite vulnerable. So substance use, of course, can trigger psychosis, particularly if you have a genetic predisposition. And we don't have tests for that right now that we can go in and do. So you got to be really careful about that because we don't know. It's, sort of like a crapshoot. So be gentle and careful with yourself relative to substance abuse and try to find out what's going on in your family. And be very, very careful if anybody in your family has a history of psychosis. You want to protect your mind, and it's incredible, the hard work I think that the species have done over millennia to develop a mind that is organized. I realize that we have some work to do in terms of developing a more kind of kinder, gentler system in terms of negative emotions, but in terms of an organized mind, that's something that we've grown, I think, come a long way with as a species, and we want to protect. Remember that affect means emotion. So here we have maybe preceded by affective symptoms, including depression. So schizophrenia may be preceded by affective or more emotionally based disorders, preceded by disorder like anxiety or depression. Okay, now we have bipolar and related disorders. And bipolar disorder is, alternating mania and depression, or this variety of negative mood states. And as we get to know, there's so much that we're learning about this emotional disequilibrium and the lack of ability to regulate these negative emotional states. For example, children who are held a lot when they're young, cuddled with love and warmth, have significantly better brain ability to manage negative emotional states. They have a larger hippocampus, and they have a larger prefrontal lobe development for and then and they have not the like inflation of the amygdala and other parts of the brain. There's multiplicity parts of the brain involved in these negative and positive states, and they're starting to sort those out. In a little bit, I'll show you. Robert Sapolsky has a new book out, Behave, where he goes into that. So if you want to jump in and really learn the neuroscience, get that book. It's awesome. And there's a lot of implications to this information and research that's coming out that's pretty heavy about how and what really I used to give an assignment, do we make humans? And, well, watch the Sapolsky video, and I'll throw that up as a question. I'm going to post it as an extra credit later discussion. So there can be psychotic symptoms with bipolar, and depending on if you're in a mania mood, then the psychosis will be inflated about our abilities and inflated about what can happen. And basically what happens with people in mania moods is they tend to do things that they regret massively later. And it's an extreme, it's an extreme state. Now, you can put a distribution curve on here, and somebody can be mildly bipolar and somebody can be severely bipolar. And those are radically different, so just keep that in mind. We have the depressive disorders, right? We have disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, where a person's not able to keep depressed moods at bay frequently enough. Major depressive disorder, where a person's sunk down in there and has a hard time getting out at all for a very long period of time. This is more of a lower grade depression that just won't go away. Here we have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is now, in there, has been validated in there in the DSM-5. Substance medication induced depressive disorder due to another medical condition. Certain medications can induce depression, for example, and others specified. Now we can help depressive disorder quite a bit. I know people are uncertain about the antidepressants, but eventually we got to realize that our neurochemistry is what we're working with is similar to, some people take allergy meds, some people are diabetic and need insulin, so that's, those things we don't even think twice about relative to the body, but we have much harder time when we think about it for the mind, but that's just because it's new to us and we're not used to thinking that way, but it's just the same thing. I mean, it's the distribution curve. Some people were born with brain chemistry that's just not going to give you enough of the necessary neurochemicals, neither the dopamine nor the serotonin, to manage the negative emotions properly, unless you were up in, maybe in ideal circumstances. So in that case, how could we possibly say that it isn't appropriate to augment with, you know, what's available and see if that isn't helpful? We obviously need to do other things as well, but certainly we need to begin to shift the way we think about this. Okay, this is the diagnostic criteria. So this is just showing you how for major depression and persistent depressive disorder, that this is some of the criteria that they lay out, right? And it shows you five or more of 9 symptoms, including at least one of depressed mood and loss of interest or pleasure in the same 2-week period. Each of these symptoms represents a change from previous functioning. So you can see that the person needs to have 5 of these 9 symptoms. And there's these diagnostic criteria to help people understand which diagnosis. And realize when people go into counseling and they want to get it on insurance, the person's going to give you a diagnosis from the book in order to get that insurance, right? Because they got to put down a number. There's nothing for, just wants to come in and talk and work out being bummed. So they've got to come up with one of these. And that's why it's easier than, let's say, it really should be, in some ways, for us to diagnose disorders, because sometimes and oftentimes I think people need to go in and get support because to deal with the vagaries and challenges of living, which can be amazingly difficult, and also to work with, individual temperament and brain chemistry in a very complex world. So it seems to be that mental coaching is even more, like, at least as important as physical coaching. And, as we wake up and realize how smart it is, that the more we know about our, avatar mind self, the better we can work with our mind self. Same with the body, right? So anxiety disorders, here's 9 mental disorders under anxiety. Separation anxiety disorder is not being able to get over separation anxiety, right? Persistent and intractable. Phobias, social anxiety, panic disorders, and panic attacks. Agoraphobia is when a person has so much negative anxiety emotion that they're unable to leave their home. They eventually just hole up. And then we have, and again, we can help agoraphobics come out, most of them, and get stronger. It's like with most psychological disorders, what we're doing is building courage, and the courage helps the disorder shrink rather than just eliminating the disorder. Then we have generalized anxiety disorder, and then medical or substance use, and then mutism is selected. That's occasionally not speaking, right? Being mute, not going mute, not being able to speak, being frozen in speech. Obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So hoarding is now its own category underneath the OCD category, and OCD is no longer in the anxiety disorder category. It has its own category, and we do understand that both OCD and hoarding have neural, let's say, neural circuitry mechanisms that are not happening quite right. Just like when people have, say, sleep disorders, there's some neurology going on with the very complicated brain chemistry. I think we still don't appreciate how complicated and sophisticated, infinitely more sophisticated than our phones and computers, our brain chemistry is. And so, how easy for some of these things to happen. And we know with OCD, there, that feeling when you make your bed and you're like, okay, it's good enough. You do the dishes, clean the kitchen. Okay, it's good enough, eventually. And even if we're perfectionistic, we can still get to the place where it's good enough. Well, the circuitry that clicks in that says it's good enough seems to not click in quite right with OCD and hoarding. So there's something neurologically going on there that we're trying to get to the bottom of. It's not just a mental thing that somebody needs to get over. Then we have trauma and stressor related disorders. And so interestingly, they've gotten their own category separate from the anxiety disorders. PTSD used to be under an anxiety disorder, and now it's in its own area. And I think that's really good because trauma is its own experience and deserves its own sort of focused area. And we're learning a great deal about how to sort of get down there and work with the substrates of where trauma gets grooved in and solidified, the neural substrates, which can be, down in the reptilian core sometimes. So we have PTSD, which you're familiar with, acute stress disorder, which is very similar to PTSD. And we have adjustment disorders. This adjustment disorder is when somebody just becomes overwhelmed with too much change in a new environment or with something that happens. Let's say somebody loses their entire family, or they go through a radical change in their life, or even just, going through a major shift from, you could lose a series of things like having to move to a new location, go to a new school, and, even a major move, be far away from your significant other or no longer with your significant other. And those are three massive changes all at once. And it could overwhelm a person, especially if they're struggling with a lot of negative emotion because they're biologically wired for that, or they have a difficult childhood. And sometimes difficult childhoods can happen because of nobody's intent for that. So reactive attachment disorder is when somebody cannot be left alone. They are too, and it can be diagnosed in adults as well. They were some kind of, it can happen in children. Like, for example, if a child, say, who is brought over from and adopted, from another country, some of those children can end up with reactive attachment if they're separated from significant caregivers very early in life, and suddenly who they count on is gone, and gone permanently. It can be a very difficult thing to work with that attachment system. So that's one of those areas that we've really got to work on. And then disinhibited social engagement disorder, and this is an unusual disorder where somebody attaches to people too easily. It's like the opposite of avoidant. It's, latching onto people right away and becoming overly attached to people too quickly. Now, the dissociative disorders, dissociative is one of those words that is, the easiest way to think about it is think about it like spacing out. You're driving along on the road and you space out. You just sort of blank out. You go, and you wake back up. You didn't fall asleep, but you went into a state of dissociation. And the reason why we can do it while we're driving is because it's a sort of a mundane thing. So doing a mundane, it's got like a meditative quality to it. And so we can just sort of blank out. So dissociative means, blanking out, where we have a breakdown of memory, awareness, identity, or perception, or disruption, right? Now, amnesia, dissociative amnesia, here it is, amnesia, refers to forgetting something for a block of time. I can't remember my 5th grade year, or I can't remember 2 weeks. And a lot of times it occurs because of brain injury, but it can also occur because of, or a concussion, or it could occur because of trauma. And then depersonalization disorder, Well, I don't want to do that one yet. Let me do dissociative fugue. And notice they're using the word dissociative, dissociative. Dissociative fugue is where a person, usually after an extreme trauma of some kind, their brain just blanks out and they forget all of their past. So amnesia and fugue are related because they're both highly memory disorders. And then we have dissociative identity disorder, DID, which is what you think of in terms of multiple personality disorder. Learning a lot about that one. I haven't lately read any kind of literature on neuroscience, PET MRI research on dissociative identity disorder patients, but I think it would be very interesting. Okay, so dissociative identity, that's multiple personality where a person has what we refer to as alters, right? And so this is actually thought to be a memory disorder. I like to describe this to students and say, like, for example, suppose, you know how most students have a side to them where you go out and you have a wild side, and then you have a more calm side where you behave. Like, even in the classroom, I'll ask students to raise their hands. How many of you, at home are the ham? You're the playful one who's always joking around, and maybe you're extroverted, but in the classroom you're really quiet. So you have two different sides of the personality. So suppose that the ham, and one of them's more natural, right? So you're adapting to the circumstance. Your more natural personality, you're changing to the circumstance, whichever one, doesn't matter. But suppose you were, suddenly you got stuck on one of those, and the quiet person that's in the class goes home, and that's how you are with everybody else, and you're not the joking, playful one anymore, or vice versa, right? So that's the idea behind dissociative identity disorder. And then you flip and you go into another one. Now, depersonalization refers to like not feeling like you're in your body, not feeling like, feeling detached from yourself. And this happens to people after trauma sometimes, where they feel like they're detached from their body and themselves. Somatic symptom and related disorders are still mysterious for us. We have conversion disorder, which is the one that Freud studied, which we don't really understand yet still. Would love to see what some of the current research is saying on that. And when I say current, I mean in the last, year or less, because, things are being discovered as we speak, kind of thing. Now, factitious disorder, that's that one in The Sixth Sense, Munchausen by proxy of the mom who poisoned her own kid, right? So falsification, all right, to self or others, factitious disorder to gain attention. Illness, anxiety disorder, we used to call hypochondria. But it becomes like an obsession, and it physically becomes more intense for the person, right? All right, and then we have other kinds of somatic disorder. Remember, soma means body, so we're talking about disorders that are felt in the physical body, but are related to psychological variables or neurological variables. We have the feeding and the eating disorders that you're already aware of, right? You may not be aware of these, so somebody could cover these in the assignment and discussion. You might have heard of one or two of those. We have other disorders like elimination disorders, which is interesting that it's separated out from sexual dysfunctions and separated out from paraphilic. So even understanding why the DSM-V just separated these out. Now, sexual dysfunctions is like not being able to feel sexual arousal or feel happy with, like, enjoy sexuality or perform sexuality. And there's not a physical cause, it's because of a psychological cause. And you can understand how that happens. And of course, we have the sleep-wake disorders. Gender dysphoria. Dysphoria is dissatisfaction or distress over something. So that's related to not feeling like you're in the right gender. Substance-related and addictive disorders. Neurocognitive disorders, or things like learning disabilities, things like that, and autism. And then we have disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. So oppositional defiant disorder is like the happiest toddler of the block. That those of you who watch that, I'll put it on the slide. It's he was that those children were opposite could have been diagnosed by a psychologist with oppositional defiant disorder. And if a child continues to do that as they get older, that's toddler age, oppositional defiant. And somebody can talk about that. The words kind of show it for you, but it's so persistent, just like that kid was, and they couldn't figure out, right? But they did end up figuring out his behavior totally changed. But if it didn't change, if things had gotten really negative, it's potentially he could go a conduct disorders when you see young, like kids 10, 11, 12, they start going into pyromania and kleptomania. Oops, sorry. And so they start starting fires and hurting animals and causing more severe problems to people around them, getting in fights a lot, having trouble with emotional regulation, being impulsive, right? And then intermittent explosive. This is anger, not being able to manage emotion and manage anger. And these people who are having a hard time managing anger are probably feeling a lot more anger than everybody else and having a harder time finding the mechanism to calm it down. So then we have personality disorders. So what I wanted to point out is that oppositional defiant as a toddler that we can't get under control and can't get to behave properly, moves later, becomes an adolescent. So they get a lot of negative feedback because they're not behaving right instead of positive. And so if things keep getting worse, then they can have conduct disorder and start doing increasingly dangerous and damaging things. And then the next place it goes to is antisocial personality disorder, which is the adult version of causing a lot of damage. And then the worst version of antisocial personality disorder we refer to as a psychopath, which is referred to a person that tends to not feel very much guilt or remorse for the harm or damage they cause to others. Now, personality disorders are another kind of psychological disorder characterized by rigid maladaptive personality traits, right? So we talked about in personality theory, looked at trait psychology and the big five, for example, or Eisenach's traits. And here, what we're looking at is the traits are maladaptive and they tend to cause distress for others even more than the person themselves. So that's not always the case. That's not the case with the people with the anxious and fearful behaviors. They have a hard time. But these guys, a lot of time, well, actually, all of these are distressing mental and emotional states, but they also are difficult on the people around them. So over here, you have paranoid personality, schizoid personality, and schizotypal, and it'd be great if somebody wants to distinguish those. Here, these are dramatic, emotional, or erratic. These are eccentric and withdrawal kinds of behaviors. Odd Woody Allen type personalities. Here we have, and also, the recluse and things like that. Here we have dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior. We have the antisocial, right? It's interesting that there's always an antisocial personality in cartoons. You have Pinky and the Brain, and you have Cartman, and you have, oh, who's the one in, what was it, Family Guy in South Park? You have Stewie, right? So it's just all the villain. So then we have borderline, and borderline personality is an attachment. It's like, I think borderline personality probably is, where is it? Reactive attachment disorder. I think these two are very connected. So, and I'm sure borderline has most of these have a biological predisposition with an environmental trigger that pushes the person in that direction. Histrionic personality disorder is what women were put in institutions a lot for in the 1800s and 1900s. Hyper-emotionality and losing it, more of a female disorder, like antisocial is more male. And then narcissistic personality disorder. So these are very intriguing. It's smart to study them. Everybody comes across somebody or several people who have a personality disorder in their lifetime. And it's smart to learn about what's going on so that you can be strategic in your approach because they don't follow the same rules as, say, 90% of the rest of the population. And then these are anxious and fearful personality disorders. Avoidant dependent personality is just what it sounds like, a person who can't be independent. And then obsessive avoidant is the person who avoids social situations and is a recluse, the extreme recluse. And obsessive compulsive personality disorder is distinct from obsessive compulsive disorder in that obsessive compulsive mental disorder, generally the person has a singular or a couple of kinds of obsessions, say a germ obsession like Howie Mandel, and he's got to wear gloves all the time, right? But with a personality, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, essentially the obsessive compulsive way of being has taken over the person's entire personality. And if anybody's seen the movie Jack Nicholson, As Good as It Gets, that's he had obsessive compulsive personality disorder all the way. And so here they are again, right, with odd behavior, dramatic behavior, anxious behavior, and then percentages. And you can see here about 9%, so 10% of the population, some of them with overlapping, right? So 10 and 100. So all or nothing versus the continuum. What this is something you already know because of the distribution curve, which means that there's a range. And so even with anxiety disorder, somebody has anxiety disorder, most are in the middle, and there's going to be low-grade anxiety disorder and extreme anxiety disorder. And of course, the idea is to move from maladaptive behavior to strong and healthy behavior instead of normal, this should say healthy. Personal distress to lower levels of distress, courage, and the ability to regulate the negative emotions that arise. Now, of course, an overwhelming negative social environment that just absolutely crushes makes that extremely difficult. We need to recognize that. Deviance means strange or difficult. That's that one about different from cultural norms. All right, here's the example of the continuum or a range and how a personality style brought to an extreme can be called conscientiousness to the extreme, seriousness. Too serious, you become depressive. Too self-confident, too self-confident, you start to become arrogant and then narcissistic. Too devoted, this is an interesting phenomenon. You can see this I see this in people who have a pretty good, well-rounded life. They have friends, they have clubs that they're involved in, they have an intellectual or artistic pursuit, they have goals, and then they get involved with a romantic partner and they become completely dependent. And then something doesn't work right and they're completely thrown down because they went from being devoted to dependent. So rather than being devoted while maintaining a diversified life, they hyper-focused, put themselves into a dependent position and crash. Now, that doesn't mean they have dependent personality disorder because, they learn and grow and pick themselves back up and evolve and change. Dependent personality disorder is when a person gets stuck there and stays there for, it's pervasive for over years and years, and it's through every dimension of the person's life. Dramatic can become histrionic, vigilant can become paranoid, sensitive can become avoidant. And we can all tell this, right? So the idea is to build strength rather than move. And life is always slinging us things to throw us down into it's up or down, and it's really easy to go down. And it's really easy to go down when a bunch of stuff happens. And it's really easy to go down if you've got a difficult system and you haven't been taught how to regulate it yet, or you don't have enough regulation strategies, and habits to help you stay, even just eating in the morning and looking at a face in the morning and feeling the sun in the morning, just these little strategies that get implemented over time, pushing out from loneliness, because loneliness is a normal experience for people in our modern culture. It was well predicted not long ago by people who saw it coming, because we're not in these little tribes anymore, right? Like the Vikings, where everything's prescribed. And what's nice about that is to make choices. But what's difficult about that is that we have too many choices and we have to go out there and create a tribe for ourselves, as compared to, and most people, their tribe comes from like getting involved with their kids and their hobbies and their work and their significant other and things like that. But when we go through transitions, say from high school to college, all of a sudden the old tribe either doesn't fit anymore or it's different. And so it's normal to go through these phases that are really difficult, where we could use with some emotional coaching. I obviously am passionate about psychology. Sorry. Okay, off the subject. So where am I? We're talking about antisocial personality disorder, the psychopath, not to be confused with psychotic or psychosis. Psychotic is loss of touch with reality. Psychosis is being in a state of loss of touch with reality. Psychopath is an antisocial personality disorder where they do a lot of negative things, a lot of times not having a sense of guilt or remorse, though not always. Okay. And here we have some stats. About half the people with the disorder have a history of arrest, 3 to 4 times as many males as females. And they're figuring out reasons for that. And I already told you about the idea of oppositional defiant, escalating to conduct, escalating to personality disorder. And here just we have a summary of the diagnostic criteria. And of course, in the DSM, the real diagnostic criteria goes on for pages. This is like a little cheat sheet kind of summary, so you can just kind of get a feel for some of the variables that are, there's a lot more than this actually in the oppositional. Oh, that was the oppositional defiant. Sorry. Here we have oppositional defiant, which is really good for you to see. And you can see that the happiest toddler on the block kid, for those of you who saw that, I'll repost it. That little child was definitely this way. He would have been diagnosed. So whether he was diagnosed as oppositional defiant or a spirited child by a psychologist who put down the number, this 313.81 for the insurance, but then told the parents, your child is spirited and we're going to find a way to help the child help things work, right? As compared to then they end up, worse in the conduct disorder. Now, prevalence means how often it occurs, how much it occurs. And we're just going to take a quick look at prevalence. You can see OCD, ADHD, almost 10%, panic disorder, major depression, more than ADHD, any anxiety disorder, very high. But that's not surprising, I don't think, given the way that our society is structured and some of the challenges and the incredibly fast pace of information and change going on is going to just create anxiety by itself. So in the next unit, of course, we're going to talk about how to get strong. Bipolar, any mood disorder, substance abuse, and so on. So 57% for any disorder. So what's that saying? That's saying that we can get overwhelmed and we can also heal. Here's prevalence of mental disorders across the world. Let's see, from the World Health Organization, and you can see that our rates are pretty high. And some of that may be a bias in reporting, because we're very good at reporting this. And here we have personality disorder prevalence. We already saw a slide on this. Okay. Now, what causes disorders? And I want to encourage you guys, like I said, there's mixed variables different for every single disorder. And we're learning more and more about it, but it's always going to be a biological dimension, a sociocultural dimension, roles, expectations, but you got to add on to here like societal structures, power structures, and then psychological influences, right? So there's all these things that are interacting. The biopsychosocial model. Here's another image of the biopsychosocial model. Influencing, including things like nutrition, all kinds of stuff, early childhood experiences and so on, interacting with the environment. Here's an image of depression and the biopsychosocial model that just looks at some of the variables, some of them biological, some of them social, and some of them psychological. Rumination refers to thinking negative thoughts a lot and spending a lot of time worrying. The mind will slip into this, and what we need to do is learn to interrupt it and not to just let it go along with it. But if we don't have enough basic neurochemicals in our brain to offset this, to manage the negative emotionality, then it's extremely difficult and even impossible to do. So that's why. And we already talked about dreaming and its relationship, right? So then there's going to be some hidden variables that we don't even know about yet. We haven't discovered them. Maybe you will discover them. So this is just a little bit of looking at some of the different kinds of variables that look at. And it says if antisocial personality disorder is not a full picture of most criminal activity, what can we say about people who commit crime, especially violent crime? And birth complications and poverty combine to increase risk. So they're just looking at different kinds of variables that influence. You can see poverty and complications, birth complications, a little less with the birth complications. All right. And then we have um, lower levels of arousal. Here, what they're saying here, this is a biological reaction. Lower levels of negative emotions when something bad happens. So they don't care, is basically the deal. So this is very, very interesting. Adrenaline excretion, negative, that stimulates negative feeling, is way higher in those with no criminal conviction. So that's very interesting. Even in non-stressful situations, it's way higher. Okay, so the resting state of, who would have thought that fear would keep you out of jail, right? This is an epigenetics article, and there's tons of this, that babies who get more cuddles have their genetics changed for years, studies show. And I want to show you this website. This is from Mind and Brain News on Science Daily. I put it on the as a resource under the assignment. You can see eye contact synchronizes with baby brain waves with baby. Here's hard birth, lasting chemicals change in brain. This is very interesting. A gentle touch, that's the one they're talking about. But I want to show you this one. Hard birth, lasting chemical changes in brain. This is very interesting to read about. You got to go down because, you can't really trust titles entirely. They always are going to be a little melodramatic, all right? Around 1 in 10 people are born prematurely, and most experience no complications. In 15 to 20% of babies before 32 weeks, bleeding happen in fluid-filled spaces called ventricles. Remember those in the brain? If it's significant, it can cause problem. All right, so down here, we found that dopamine, a chemical that's important for learning and enjoyment, is affected in people who had early brain injury, but not in the way a lot of people would have thought. So we're going to scroll down. Oh, dopamine levels were actually lower. Let's see here. Okay. Dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that helps us regulate negative emotion. So those who've had small brain injuries around the time of birth had lower levels of dopamine in the brain. Is very interesting to learn. Okay, we just have a few more slides. Oops. Just a few more. I probably should have gone backwards. Although it's always good to do another quick run. These are just the different disorder categories. You're going to pick one, and then you'll read about what other people read about and learn about them that way. It's interesting that we already know most of these disorders, isn't it? And they weren't even identified, like 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And yet it's common language for us. Now, here he is, Robert. Robert's got a new book out called Behave, and it's just a blockbuster. It's awesome. And this is a great little talk. And I'm going to set up a discussion on this for extra credit on this. You can't actually click this. You got to click here for the talk. And he talks about, the biopsychosocial model and all the various influences. And, Sapolsky, he will articulate some sentences that are just like, wow, punches. So look for those sentences. In the last video we watched, he articulated some things like, he has these great one-liners. If, the bonobo troupe can transform their society in one generation, then we've got no excuse. Another one-liner he had in there was that, the idea, shibboleth, that we're inevitably an aggressive species and that can never change is obviously false. So he throws some in here too. He's got some amazing one-liners in here. So listen for them and bring them into the discussion. And of course, this is going to be an extra credit discussion. So you'll see it posted soon. These are just some terms to remember, just reminders. Affect means emotion, like, well, typo. People with severe depressive disorder often demonstrate little or no affect. Comorbid means having two disorders or more at the same time, or the symptoms of several disorders, which is very common. Psychotic is in psychosis, losses touch with reality. Psychopath, antisocial is different, which is more related to causing harm and not feeling guilt or remorse. I want to emphasize here at the end that the idea is to get better. Remember what we said earlier, that disorders aren't fixed. We can get stronger and we can get better. And we have some really good treatments now for a large number of disorders. I mean, extraordinary ones. And, there's a lot of room for learning and growing in this area too. So very exciting. And of course, it's going to be the emphasis of our next and last, another typo, learning module, Therapies, Mental Health, and Strength, with a quote from Lao Tzu. So that'll be our last learning module. And then the final. That concludes for today, everybody.